kids.
Say it right now. Say it right now. What happened in Reno sucks, man. Why don't you just say it, Carl? Spit it out. Spit it out. What happened in Reno really was a lousy thing for these kids to do.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and welcome back to my How They Changed the Game series. This is where I talk about bands or artists or labels that may or may not have been commercially successful, but still made some kind of very important contribution to the culture. And today I'm going to talk about what I think is probably one of the top 3 most important hardcore bands of all time, Earth Crisis. If you're already familiar with Earth Crisis, then you probably already know why I'm saying they're so important, but if you're not familiar, what makes them so important? Well, I think there's really 2 things. First of all, you may not even realize it, but if you are vegan or you know somebody who's vegan, there's a pretty damn good chance that it's indirectly because of Earth Crisis. And secondly, they're also a big part of why hardcore incorporates so much metal these days. And if you haven't heard them, this is what they sound like. And I want to really quickly thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with more than 25,000 classes in design, business, and more. Premium membership gives you unlimited access so you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you. And best of all, there's a free 2-month trial for the first 500 people who sign up using the promo link in the description for this video. So if you want to get your learn on and support the channel by showing Skillshare how awesome this audience is, hit that link, sign up, and we'll see you there. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, A Sad State of Affairs. The band officially started in 1989, but they didn't get started for real until 1991, and their first release, the All Out War EP, dropped in 92. And that EP did get them a little bit of attention, but it mostly just kind of came and went. What really blew them up was their second EP, Firestorm. And Firestorm was like a goddamn nuclear bomb that leveled the entire punk and hardcore scene in an instant. It was really that big of a deal, at least from my point of view. And in order to understand why it was such a big deal, you have to first understand a few things about the early 90s scene they came up in. First of all, in my personal opinion, in musical terms, the early 90s were one of the lowest points ever for hardcore. Almost all the good bands of the 80s had either broken up or started playing like funk metal or hard rock, some other awful stuff, and the new generation of bands was still kind of trying to find their voice. As a couple examples of the typical early 90s hardcore sound. And with that weird, bloofy, reverby production that makes just about anything sound bad. So that was like the musical side of hardcore, and I think it was a similar situation in terms of ideology. It was kind of in between movements, in my opinion. The 80s had straight edge, the DC Revolution Summer thing, the crossover thing, but the early 90s just didn't really have anything. We were like rebels without a cause, I guess you could say. And as far as veganism in particular, well, it just really wasn't on the map at all for anyone in or out of hardcore. There were plenty of vegetarians in punk and hardcore. Youth of Today played a big role in driving that in the hardcore scene with their 1988 song No More, which, by the way, has an amazingly bad video that I suggest you watch. My favorite part is when Porcel grabs the burger out of the kid's hand like, no, man, it's not cool. So vegetarianism was a thing, but veganism was really not a thing. And the few vegans that did exist were not hardcore kids or cool people that you would want to hang out with, or at least that I wanted to hang out with. These were the hippie, we live in a VW bus in the woods with our herd of goats type people that nobody in the hardcore scene wanted anything to do with. The only people really pushing veganism in hardcore was a band called Vegan Reich, who, as you can tell by their name, were very much about veganism. And they're most definitely the ones who really pioneered the militant vegan thing and inspired Earth Crisis a lot in that regard. But they didn't get a lot of traction for a couple reasons. First of all, their music was just a little rough around the edges. And also, their stuff was all self-released, and so it didn't really get a lot of traction outside their immediate circle of people who already knew who they were. So basically, that's the context for what I'm about to talk about. Hardcore was in this low point, both musically and ideologically, with no really clear direction or leader like Youth of Today were for the previous generation. And although vegetarianism was common, veganism was almost unheard of. But both of those things were about to change in a big way.
But some teenagers have found a way to win the respect of their friends without doing drugs. ABC's Michelle Morris reports on the kids who call themselves the straight edge.
Which brings us to part number 2, the Firestorm from 1993 to 1994. The first sign that something big was happening is when the rumors and photos of Earth Crisis' set at the 1993 More Than Music Festival in Dayton, Ohio started to circulate. In the words of their friend DJ Rose, the guy who actually originally came up with the name Earth Crisis. When Earth Crisis played the first More Than Music Festival in Ohio in 1993, the people booking it had this attitude that nobody gave a shit about the band. They acted like they were doing Earth Crisis a favor by letting them play as maybe second or third band of a night with probably 10 bands. We brought carloads of people with us from Syracuse. Before they started, I remember Rob Fish from Resurrection was trying to unplug their equipment and shit like that. Then the band started and people went fucking apeshit. Afterward, we watched a video of the set and we counted 400 flashbulbs going off during the first song, Firestorm. That's when we knew people were ready. That festival lit the fire of interest in the band. I had given an Earth Crisis demo to Tony Brummel from Victory Records, and he threw it out the car window without even listening to it. Now he wanted to put out their record. And that record was what became the real game changer for Earth Crisis and hardcore in general, the Firestorm 7-inch, which came out in 1993 on Victory Records. I'm really struggling with how to describe the impact that that song had on the punk and hardcore scene. Like I said earlier, it was like a nuclear bomb. I mean, it was the topic of conversation among everybody in the scene, from crust punks to hardcore kids to pop punk kids and everywhere in between. Literally everybody was talking about it. And before I go any further, here's the song for anybody who hasn't heard it, and make sure you read the lyrics. In case it wasn't obvious, basically the song is about killing drug dealers. And if you're laughing or shaking your head right now about how over the top this song is, then you're definitely not alone. I remember when I got this and I was like, holy fuck, they wrote a song about killing drug dealers. And I was like 15 years old and very straight edge, so my next thought was, and that's so fucking awesome. Of course, in 2019, I'm not so sure that just rounding up and killing drug dealers is a great idea, but it sure sounded cool back then to my teenage brain. And there were plenty of other kids who were just as stoked on it as I was, but we were definitely in the minority. The vast majority of this scene hated the band in a way that I don't think I saw again until Broken Side came along 15 years later. That's how much people hated Earth Crisis. Back then, as I've talked about before, zines were kind of like our version of Instagram. Scene drama played out in the editorials of smaller zines or in the letters section of the big zines like Maximumrocknroll, Punk Planet, or Heart Attack, and there was no shortage of drama about Earth Crisis. Mostly some variation on how they should be banned from the scene because they're too militantly vegan and straight edge, too metal, or oftentimes all the above. Now I'm going to talk a lot more about how their impact rippled out even more dramatically over the next few years, but basically what it came down to was this. Before Firestorm, hardly anybody in the punk and hardcore scene was thinking or talking about veganism. And after Firestorm, everybody was talking about it. Not always in a positive way, mind you, but they were definitely talking about it.
One group of kids has found an extreme way to just say no. They're called straight edge, and they're everywhere.
Part 3, why Earth Crisis blew up. Before I go on to the next chapter of Earth Crisis and their impact, I want to just stop for a minute and talk about why they got so much traction, because I think there's a lot to be learned here for anybody else out there who's trying to get the traction for their band or any other creative project, really. First of all, Firestorm is a fucking great song. It's so catchy, it's so simple, it's perfect for singing along at a hardcore show. It's almost like a tribal war chant or something, which actually looking back on it, I think is probably exactly what they intended it to be. That opening riff just feels like a primal call to battle, right? And I remember it being seen almost as an act of heresy that they had that riff that was just open note chugs. And it seems hilarious to say that now when there are literally thousands of bands whose entire catalog of songs is mostly just open note chugs in various patterns. But back then it was totally unheard of. I remember people almost being like, well, you can't do that, as though they had cheated at some sort of unstated musical game. And in addition to the song itself being great, the production was also incredible by the standards of 1993 hardcore. I mean, compare this to this. It's night and day, right? And obviously by today's standards, it's pretty raw, but that was incredibly crisp and punchy and clear for its time. Basically, what it comes down to is that they had what I think was the heaviest hardcore song ever recorded at that time, coupled with these insanely over-the-top, shocking lyrics. To ignore it was just not an option. It was that compelling. And also, regardless of how you feel about Victory Records, the fact that they were on Victory was, I think, a really big part of it. Victory was still a small label back then, but even so, they were still better at marketing than any other hardcore label in 1993. And their marketing, their promotions, their distribution, just all of that was absolutely key to getting Earth Crisis' message out at scale. And the last reason for why they blew up, last but definitely not least, they weren't doing it alone. They came from the relatively small city of Syracuse, New York. It's really just a small college town, but back then there was an extremely active scene in Syracuse with some very creative, very hardworking people who all played a role in Earth Crisis' success. There's actually a really cool segment from CNN documenting the 90s Syracuse scene. I'll link it in the description. I've watched it many times. A lot of the people I'm talking about here are in that CNN segment. People like Guav, who put out their first 7-inch and did their iconic logo and also designed a ton of other graphics for them. DJ Rose, who, like I said, I think originally came up with the Earth Crisis name. There's the guy who ran the venue, the Lost Horizon, whose name escapes me, but he put on all the shows there, had tons and tons of great bands come through town, and a whole host of other people that I don't even know about, but deserve some credit in their own way. In any case, Firestorm was lightning in a bottle. It was a great song with great production, with these incredibly powerful, shocking lyrics, and the marketing machine of Victory behind them. Firestorm was a massive hit, at least as much as hardcore can have massive hits, but it was really just the beginning. Part 4, The Virus Spreads, from 1995 to 1998. As important as Firestorm was, because it's definitely what put Earth Crisis and Vegan Straight Edge on the map, it was their debut full-length album in 1995 that really planted their flag. That album is called Destroy the Machines, and it's my personal favorite Earth Crisis release. It's really the perfection of that chuggy, prong, or Pantera with vegan lyrics kind of formula that they pioneered and so many other bands would go on to copy. If you haven't heard it, I highly suggest checking it out. In my opinion, it still holds up today. Love that guitar tone. And to me, the really pivotal decision that they made here, the one that would really help them accomplish their mission of spreading the message of Vegan Straight Edge, was that they chose to go beyond the hardcore scene. So they got themselves a real booking agent and hit the road for the next maybe, 5 or 6 years, basically. They went out with big metal bands like Biohazard and Sepultura. They did Ozfest. Remember them hitting Europe and Asia really hard? They took their message all over the world to an audience that had never heard of Vegan Straight Edge before. And I'm sure that was not easy. I'm sure that was fucking grueling. But you know what? It worked. By the late 90s, hardcore was just absolutely full of Earth Crisis clones. There were more bands that I could possibly count playing that Earth Crisis style chugga Vegan Straight Edge stuff. It almost became like the default for a hardcore band at the time. Kind of like how doing the Rise Records, Joey Sturgis kind of sound was the default for the late 2000s metalcore bands. It was just everywhere. By 99 or so, there were Earth Crisis clones in just about every city in the US and Europe, and even a few in Japan and other parts of Asia. And hardcore kids everywhere were going vegan in droves. Were most of the bands good? Nah, not really. Did most of the kids stay vegan? No, I didn't. I stopped being vegan after a couple years. But still, there's no question in my mind that Earth Crisis had left their mark. If their mission was to spread the cause of Vegan Straight Edge, then they most definitely did that. And just to kind of underscore what I said about how they took the message of Vegan Straight Edge way beyond the hardcore scene, check out a few of these clips of the mainstream TV coverage they got.
Straight Edge is a lifetime commitment to never drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, take illegal drugs for escapism. As the symbol of straight edge, because when kids would go into bars to go to the shows, if they were underage, they'd get an X on their hands so that they wouldn't be served alcohol.
The X is the wedding ring of our dedication to straight edge.
Do you have any sense of how influential this whole straight edge thing is at this point? I mean, is it having any kind of impact on?
It fully is. I mean, we've gotten mail from all throughout Europe, Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Singapore, Japan.
I really can't think of a hardcore band before or since that's gotten that kind of coverage. Pretty amazing to think about it in hindsight. You know, they went from their little scene in Syracuse to CNN and Geraldo in the space of like 3 or 4 years.
After a 6-month investigation, Reno police are calling the so-called straight edgers a gang, and for good reason. They've been accused of enforcing their opposition to smoking and drinking by force.
However, their success in spreading the message of Vegan Straight Edge did come at a price, as it always does. Part 5, The Dark Side. Basically, by writing songs about killing people they didn't like drug dealers and vivisectionists, they made veganism edgy, which is what made hardcore kids like me care about it. Because, you know, when you're a 15-year-old hardcore kid, you like edgy stuff, right? But putting out that much angry, negative energy also fueled some really dumb behavior in the scene. Some really bad, toxic trends.
Their message, just say no, or else.
The whole militant straight edge thing just got really out of control, and although Earth Crisis never really explicitly encouraged it, I do think it's fair to place some of the blame for that at their feet, because like I said, if you write songs about killing people, then you can't really be surprised when it attracts some aggro people who want to use hardcore as a venue for beating people up in the name of veganism, right?
Kids, say it right now. Say it right now. What happened in Reno sucks, man. Why don't you just say it, Carl? Spit it out. Spit it out. What happened in Reno really was a lousy thing for these kids to do.
This is when I saw the beginnings of the crew stuff start to happen a lot in hardcore, and there was all kinds of other cringy stuff like the kill your local drug dealer shirts that somebody made. I mean, come on. I can accept that hardcore is to some degree inherently aggressive and angry, and that some level of violence is going to come with that, but at the same time, I don't think it needs to be encouraged, right? I mean, we don't need to pour fuel on the flames of guys in their teens and early 20s who want to act out their crew fantasies, right? That's really my only criticism of the Earth Crisis phenomenon, and again, they really never directly endorsed any of this stuff, so I'm not sure how much you can really blame them for it. However, that sure didn't stop people from blaming them for all kinds of wild shit and making up all kinds of crazy rumors about how they were these out-of-control, violent thugs. And if you've ever met any of them or hung out with them, you know that that is totally not who they are. But I remember hearing so many stories about them, like how they hit some kid in the head with a brick for smoking outside one of their shows, you know, about how they pulled a gun on this guy or that guy. That kind of thing got repeated and passed around the hardcore rumor mill a lot.
We don't drink, we don't smoke, don't do drugs.
But what happens when virtue leads to violence?
A group of straight edgers grabbed this guy and proceeded to start to try and carve an X into his back.
One of the more well-known examples was a song called Get the Kid with the Sideburns by a band called Reversal of Man. And here's what they have to say about it. We showed up to their show dressed as the Village People. Earth Crisis wasn't stoked, so they had their South Florida minions come after us. A bunch of tough guys against a bunch of skinny punk nerds. Makes sense, right? But all they could get their hands on was my afro wig. End of action. Once Earth Crisis began setting up, they asked the venue to turn out the lights. My buddy Charlie spoke up and said something to the effect of, "So you can try to fight us again in the dark?" Those words sparked a riot. Instantly, multiple factions were fist fighting, and at one point, Carl from Earth Crisis jumps up on top of their merch table, spots me in the crowd without my wig, exposing my patchy sideburns, and yells, "Get the kid with the sideburns!" John Willie, our drummer, happened to be fighting their guitarist next to that table. He fell to the ground, rolled under it, ultimately making it collapse, Carl and all, on top of the two of them. By that point, we were all making a beeline out the threshold to safety. Now, I'm pretty sure I heard some variation of this story where they chased the kid around town before beating him with a baseball bat or something like that, when in reality, it sounds like they just got in a little scuffle and made some Costco card table with a few animal rights scenes on it fall over. Like, no big deal, right? Definitely not what I would call a riot. But that was par for the course of the Earth Crisis back then. They were like these comic book villains in the eyes of the punk scene. But anyway, the point is that although I think their overall message and contribution was definitely a positive one, there was also a bit of a dark side to it that I think has to be mentioned.
Earth Crisis played the first show I ever went to back in the day in 1993. Firestorm was the first record I ever bought. I wouldn't be here standing today if it wasn't for them. Plain and simple.
Which brings us to part 6, the legacy. So here in 2019, what is Earth Crisis's legacy? Well, if you ask me, I think it's a pretty fucking impressive one. First of all, like I said at the beginning of the video, if you're vegan, there's a good chance that it's indirectly because of Earth Crisis. They were, without question, the people who made veganism a big part of hardcore and punk, which in turn inspired people like Davey Havok and Andy Hurley to go vegan, who then inspired thousands of other people to go vegan, and so forth and so on.
Destroy the Machines is my Star Wars original trilogy for hardcore music. It is almost entirely the reason that I became vegan straight edge.
Safe to say that without Destroy the Machines and without that band, I may have never become vegan myself.
For all the shit people talked, for all the times people threw meat at them at shows or went up on stage wearing fur coats, and I saw both of those things happen with my own eyes more than once in the case of people throwing meat at them, and for all the cringy militant edge crew stuff that they kind of indirectly inspired, they made a real fucking difference. There are probably millions of people today who are vegan as a direct result of the work that they did in the 90s, and I think that's pretty cool.
Hardcore wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for that band. Everybody knows it. People can go into denial, they can say what they want, they can do this, they can do that. Every single band is influenced by them. and every single band is what they are today if it wasn't for them.
And they changed hardcore forever on a musical level too. They're the band that made Chugs a thing, the band that brought the Pantera and Prong kind of riffs to the forefront of hardcore.
Their perspective on hardcore was beyond what I had known hardcore to be and what I had defined hardcore to be. And they had moved it musically into a very different place that was much more aggressive than what I was familiar with.
Again, they're not the only ones who ever did it, but they were, in my opinion, the ones who really blew it up. So if you like breakdowns in your hardcore, which I definitely do, then you should send Earth Crisis a thank you note. Say thank you, Scott, for the breakdowns. And they're not perfect, who is? But look, I think that they accomplished what they set out to do. They had a big, audacious goal, and they kind of pulled it off. I think it's fair to say that they did change the world, at least their corner of it.
It's music with a message for fans of the movement called straight edge.
And lastly, as I've been doing lately, a few takeaways for you. If you've got a band or a podcast or any other kind of project that you're trying to get traction for, what are the lessons to be learned from what Earth Crisis did? Thing number one is that a few people can make a huge difference. Really, the core of the Syracuse scene was probably around a dozen people, including the guys in Earth Crisis. And look what that small group of people accomplished by giving it 100%. And with all due respect to them, I wouldn't say that there's anything incredibly special about any of those people. And I mean that in a good way. What I mean is that if they can do it, there's absolutely no reason why you or I can't do it, right? And thing number two, don't be afraid to be misunderstood. You know that Jesus comic that people use for a meme, like everybody hated him because he spoke the truth or whatever? Well, that's pretty much how it works. Almost anything important or interesting or groundbreaking is going to be hated at first. That's just the way it is. And if you believe in what you're doing, you have to know that if you weather the storm and you just keep grinding, you will be proven historically correct, just like Earth Crisis were. And if you're trying to get traction for a project, it's never a bad idea to hone your design and marketing skills. And you know what's a great resource for that? Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month. And the first 500 of my subscribers to use the link in the description will get a free 2-month trial. I know a lot of you guys have questions about social media. I would check out Sophia Chang's Instagram course. Gary Vaynerchuk also has a great one. If any of you are interested in design, whether that's lettering or typography, anything like that, I would highly suggest you check out Jessica Hish's logo design masterclass. She's one of the best in the game when it comes to lettering. And maybe my favorite on Skillshare, Aaron Draplin. He's one of the very best type designers of the past, 20, 30 years. He's got a lot to teach. Very cool, fun guy who, by the way, likes Poison Idea. So if you're interested in typography, if you like Poison Idea, check out Aaron Draplin's class. Again, first 500 people to sign up using the link in the description in this video will get a free 2-month trial. Okay guys, that's it for me. I've done a lot of talking. Now it's time for me to turn it over to you. So let me know in the comments, what do you think of Earth Crisis? If you were around back then, what are your memories of how they were perceived? Do you remember any especially funny, crazy rumors about them? And if you're younger, what's your read on how Earth Crisis is seen in the scene these days, according to kids these days? I'd be super curious to know more about that. And has there been a single hardcore band since Earth Crisis that got that much press and TV, like mainstream press and TV coverage? I don't think so, but let me know if I'm wrong. So hit me up with the comments. Let me know what you guys think. I want to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.